Alrighty, so what are ITTOs? Well, we know that ITTO stands for Inputs, Tools, Technologies, and Outputs. This concept comes from the PMBOK 6, when the 49 processes that we study today were finalized. And they've carried us through the last two versions of the exam since 2017. So we've been studying these same 49 processes for several years now. For those of you who are planning to take the exam in July after the new exam is introduced, PMI did introduce a new set of processes a couple of months ago when they released the PMBOK 8. So they'll have a new grid with only 40 processes and a new set of ITTOs. So if you're planning to take the exam after July, this is still good information because even though the processes will change, the concept and the way that you want to use them on the exam will remain the same. So this is still good information either way, but just keep in mind that you'll have different processes to study. All right, so what is an input? An input is an artifact that's required or that should be reviewed before a process begins. An artifact is a template, a document, a project deliverable, something tangible that's created during the project. An output is an artifact that's created as a result of the process being completed. So that can be something tangible as well that you take and go on to the next process. So an example of this, let's say that we're building a new call center from the ground up. Well, an input to the execution phase of that building project could be the blueprint that was created during planning, because we need that blueprint to direct us on where to lay the foundation, build the walls, install the doors. An output could be an approved building inspection, or it could be the call center itself, right? The final product of that process. Some inputs and outputs are unique to specific processes. Others are very common across multiple processes. So let's take a look at a few. The most common inputs across all 49 processes are going to be OPAs and EEFs. Now, OPAs are organizational process assets. These are things like templates, SOPs, any kind of historical information that's readily available at an organization that will help the current project team save time or effort. So basically things that we can use that will save us, from doing double work that a previous project team already did. And then EEFs are things like the organizational structure, the hierarchy, the underlying politics, different factors like weather, laws, regulations. These are things that affect the project that we have to work around. And these two are inputs to almost every single process on the grid. EEFs specifically are an input to 38 out of 49 processes on the grid, and OPAs are an input to 35 processes out of 49. So they are definitely the most common across the board. The project management plan is the second most common input, feeding into about 26 processes on the grid. So it's definitely a very common input that you'll want to know helps guide different processes throughout the projects. Now, the project charter is the fourth most common. It's heavily used at the beginning of the project, mostly during initiation and planning, but it kind of falls off during execution and it comes back around during closing and in some monitor and control processes. So these are the most four important inputs that you'll want to know for the exam. When it comes to the most common outputs, the top number one would be change requests. And that's because change requests can literally be generated from any process at any time by anyone on the project. A stakeholder can request a change, a product owner, a project sponsor, any customer can request a change, and it could happen as a result of, going over budget, identifying new risks, having to replan the way that we manage quality, for example. So a change request can literally be generated at any time on a project. The last three, updates to different documents, updates to the project management plan, updates to OPAs. These are very common outputs, and you don't really need to know these for the exam per se. Out of all of the inputs and outputs, knowing the most unique outputs is going to be key to understanding the process domain on the exam. So I'll go over the most unique outputs towards the middle of our hour. And if you guys have any questions, please feel free to unmute, raise your hand, or just drop it in the chat. I'll try to keep an eye out in the chat as I go along. All right, let's switch over to tools and techniques. So a tool or a technique is a method, an approach, a practice that's used to complete a process or make decisions while we're executing that process. and it leads us to creating a successful output. And so the most common tools and techniques are going to be things like expert judgment, right? Knowing how to decipher through different decisions and scenarios, data gathering, meetings, focus groups, one-on-ones, workshops, different types of analyses. So if you're studying for your PMP and you have been, you've probably heard about things like alternatives analysis, root cause analysis, data analysis, interpersonal skills, right? Knowing how to manage your team, knowing how to lead and influence and empower, and then decision-making techniques. These are all actual PMI concepts and terms that you may see on the exam as ways to help you get through each process. Now, tools and techniques are not documents, okay? They're not artifacts. They're not tangible things that come out of a process. They just kind of help you get the work done.
And she got about.
Sorry about that. All right, so tools and techniques are not documents. They are concepts and things that help you get the work done, help you collaborate, and help you kind of lead your team as you go about the process. Now, there are some specific tools and techniques that you'll want to be aware of. Things like affinity mapping. That's when you have a large group of ideas and you kind of categorize them into big buckets. Think about, Post-it notes that they used to use back in the day. There'd be a whiteboard full of Post-it notes and they would have to kind of organize them in some way. So they would use an affinity map to kind of group them into different buckets. That's what an affinity map is. A fishbone diagram or an Ishikawa diagram, those are used to get to the root cause of an issue or used during a root cause analysis. Different techniques for collaborating and making decisions, things like Roman voting, which is just thumbs up, thumbs down, or thumbs to the side. Remember the future, planning poker, Moscow method. These things should be familiar to you if you've been studying for your PMP prep course. And now the key to understanding most of the tools and techniques is mostly just knowing the terminology. For example, if you know that the fishbone diagram, right, and the Ishikawa diagram is used for root cause analysis, then you won't pick that as the answer to a question that's asking about prioritizing risks or estimating costs, right? So just knowing what each of these is and getting familiar with the technology will help you get through tools and techniques on that process part of the exam. My biggest piece of advice to start to get familiar with these terms and concepts is to create flashcards. It's really just knowing the verbiage and knowing when to use each of these tools. Now, we don't have enough time to cover each of these, in like comprehensively a full list. There's a lot of tools and techniques. But again, if you've been studying and you have a prep course, you should be able to get a good load and batch of flashcards to cover your tools and techniques for the process domain. Okay, so just kind of do some digging in your prep course and start creating flashcards for every tool and technique that you see. All right, so how do inputs, outputs, processes, and tools and techniques work together? Well, this is how it starts. We have our inputs, right? That could be a project charter, a project management plan. It could be an environmental factor. Anything that we need to review or consider will be an input to our process, okay? And if you remember the process grid, or if you've been attending my PMP refresh webinars, you'll know that each process is categorized by a process group in a knowledge area. That process has its own set of tools and techniques, and they do overlap over processes. So tools and techniques aren't as unique as some outputs are. But each process does use a group of tools and techniques, and that ultimately gets us to our outputs, right? The things that we want to say are complete as a result of this process. And outputs are really why where you want to focus when you're preparing for the process domain. Can't talk today. So we're going to go over a few sets of unique outputs, but first I want you to look at these practice questions and then get an answer in your mind, right? Figure out how you would answer these questions, how you would think through them logically without the information that I'm about to reveal to you. I have 3 practice questions for you, so you can drop your answer in the chat. The first question, during planning, a PM receives approval to baseline the schedule. Which artifact will likely be produced next? So drop your answer in the chat. Is it going to be the cost management plan, the basis of estimates, units of measure, or resource breakdown structure? Which one is going to be created after the schedule baseline? And I'll give you guys a few minutes to think this through. All right, I see lots of A's. Cost management plan. Okay, I see D, resource breakdown structure. Nice. What are you guys thinking? This is a very kind of common process style question that you'll get on the exam. What will the PM do next? What will be produced next? What's the next best step? Those are very common PMI style questions. So it looks like A is going to take the majority there. Okay, I'm actually going to withhold the answers from you guys until we go over the next portion. All right, question number 2. The project team has finished the development of a software module and has internally tested it to ensure it meets the technical quality metrics defined in the plan. Which output is produced at the end of this review? Are you going to have accepted deliverables, verified deliverables, validated scope, or final release? What's your answer? What are you guys thinking? After a review, a quality review, an internal quality review, that's probably the key word there. What are you going to have as a result of that process? Don't be afraid to guess wrong here. I am going to give you the right answer, and I'm going to show you how to logically think through these questions. That's why we're here. All right, Carice says B, verified deliverables. I need one more. Okay, I got a few Bs. Nice. Okay, seems like we're on the same page there. Let's go on to our final question, number 3. The project team has finished decomposing deliverables into manageable work packages. The scope statement and dictionary are finalized and approved. What is the most logical next step for the PM? So should he or she begin executing, control scope, obtain formal acceptance, or develop the schedule? Which one would come next using our PMI mindset? All right, I got a few Bs. Control scope changes. Okay, nice. D, develop the schedule. Very nice. Okay, looks like mostly Bs and Ds. Okay, we'll come back to these 3 questions and I'll give you the answers and the why behind each answer as we go on through the training. Very good. Alrighty, so to understand the major outputs and why they're so important to the process domain, let's take a step back quickly. If you've been attending my webinars, you know that there's a logical flow of the processes across the process grid, specifically in each planning area. If you look at scope, for example, there's a flow to the scope planning processes. You'll know that every single knowledge area will start with a plan blank management process, but then it gets down to the specifics. So to gather your scope, you first have to collect all of your requirements, right? You got to know what people want, what they don't want, prioritize them accordingly, rank them, see what's going to make it and what's not. And then you define the scope. So you start to narrow down that list of requirements and really figure out what we are going to do and what we're not going to do on this project. And at the very end, we create our WBS, which gives us our scope baseline. So you're going from gathering data to finalizing it, defining it and refining it, and then finally baselining it. So there's a logical flow within each group of planning processes on the process grid. And that's what you want to study and memorize on the exam. So let's break it down by knowledge area because each of these processes has a unique output associated with it. And that's the part that you want to know for the process domain. That's where you're going to connect the dots on each of those process questions. So we'll look at each major output per knowledge area. And when I say major output, I just mean the most unique output to that process, meaning you're not going to find that output in any other process except for that specific one. So we'll start with integration. Now, the way to read this outputs table is to look at your processes up here, right? You have develop project charter for initiating, develop project management plan for planning, et cetera, et cetera. Down here, you have a major output. So for each line that begins with a capital letter, that's a new output for that process, and it's color-coded. So for example, develop project charter has 2 outputs. It has the project charter itself and the assumption log. People often forget about the assumption log, but they are 2 major outputs from develop project charter process. For develop project management plan, you're going to get 3 major outputs. You're going to get your overall project management plan, your change management plan, and the configuration management plan. You'll want to know that All three of those come out of this process of developing the project management plan. Now, here's where the colors come into play. Direct and managed project work, that's our first integrated execution process, right? We're in integration management and we're in the executing process group. So the outputs of direct and managed project work are going to be the deliverables, the issue log, and work performance data. Those are three major outputs that you'll want to know from this integration process. For managed project knowledge, the second process in integration executing, your output is going to be lessons learned register. That's it. That's your major output for that process. And so it goes on for each different group of processes. Now, again, we won't have a chance to go through each of these outputs individually in this hour, but these are screenshots from my overall process guide that's available on my website. It's $4.99, and it gives you some tips on how to memorize the process groups up here and all of the 10 knowledge areas from integration, scope, down to quality, communications, and stakeholders. And it gives you these output tables so that you can start to associate the outputs with the process. And again, we won't have a chance to review these, but I am going to go through each knowledge area. So please take as many screenshots as you need to use this for your studies later on. So the reason this is important, let's just say you get a question about the PM just received an approval for a change request that he or she submitted. Which process was just completed? Well, that question is referring to an approved change request. I know that approved change requests are an output of perform integrated change control. So that's the process that the project manager just completed. And I know that simply by associating the major output with the process. And that's how PMI is going to ask you the questions. It's not going to refer to the actual process. It's most likely going to refer to the artifact or the output or a document that's created as a result of the process. And you'll have to know which process it's associated to know where you are on the grid. So it's kind of a puzzle piece, that you have to put together in the process domain. Let's look at another area. So for scope, we're going to look through this and pay attention to the color codes again. So for plan scope management, our very first planning process and scope, our outputs are going to be our scope management plan and our requirements management plan. These are going to tell us how to manage our scope and how to manage our requirements. For collect requirements, our major output is going to be the requirements traceability matrix. If you've been preparing for your exam and taking practice questions, you've probably seen this term come up in a question or two. So that's why it's so important, because PMI loves to reference the outputs and not actually the process. It's trying to test you to see if you understand the flow of processes in the overall process grid. So continuing on, define scope, the major output is going to be the scope statement. Create WBS is a process, the last planning process and scope. So that's going to give you your scope baseline. Okay, it's imperative to get to know these outputs and associate them with the appropriate processes. I can't stress that enough. Now, moving over to monitor and control. Validate scope has a main output of accepted deliverables. Deliverables that are accepted are from the customer. This is a very customer-focused process, okay? You'll notice control scope does not have any outputs, and that's the case for most of the monitor and control processes. They really don't have any major outputs to consider. Most of your major outputs are going to come from the planning area of the process grid. So for example, if you get a question that says, the team has just finalized a detailed version of the scope, what should they do next? Well, a detailed version of the scope is PMI's way of saying they just finished creating a scope statement. That's the most detailed version of the scope that you're going to get on a project. So if they just finished creating the scope statement, then they're likely going to be creating the schedule baseline next, or the scope baseline next, excuse me. So again, follow the order of the planning processes to know what you should do next on the exam, which is often what PMI is asking. Is this making sense so far? Any questions or comments? Is this good information? Give me a quick yes or a shout. Okay, I see a thumbs up. That makes me feel good. All right, so let's keep moving on. We'll review each knowledge area, then we'll go back to our practice questions to tie it all in. Now, again, for schedule management, there's a lot of outputs, but they're mostly going to be in the planning area. So for plan schedule management, you'll get a schedule management plan. Here's another tip for the exam. Notice that anytime you have a plan blank management process, meaning plan schedule management, plan quality management, plan risk management, whatever the knowledge area is, you're going to end up with a blank management plan. So plan scope management is going to give you a scope management plan. Plan quality management is going to give you a quality management plan, and so on and so forth. And it's always, always going to be the very first process in each bucket of planning processes. And your management plans only tell you how to manage that area. It does not tell you what is included in the project. For example, your scope management plan is going to tell you how to manage the scope. It is not going to tell you what your scope is. And so often I see people choosing, review the scope management plan to know what the scope is on a question. That's not correct because the management plans only tell you how to manage the scope. It's not going to tell you what the requirements are, what the exclusions are, or what the actual tasks or activities are in the scope. So just keep that in mind for all of your management plans because this is one that trips people up quite a bit. So defined activities is the first planning process underneath our main one, and that's going to give you your activity list. From there, you're going to sequence the activities, okay? Follow the flow. So first you have to list out the activities, then you start to order them in an order that makes sense for the project. That's going to give you a network diagram, or basically one big visual of your project schedule and all the different activities that need to take place and when they need to take place. That's all a network diagram is. Estimate activity durations is going to give you a basis of estimates. Anytime you have a process that starts with the word estimate, you're going to have basis of estimates as one of your outputs. A basis of estimates is just a document justifying how you created this estimate. It could be a cost estimate, schedule estimate, or a resource estimate. But it justifies, how you came up with the numbers, and it also covers the level of confidence that you have in that quote and the margin of accuracy, right? Is this a rough order of magnitude quote where there's a 75% margin of error, or is this more of a definitive quote where there's a tight window of error? It's a pretty accurate quote. So you want to get to know and get familiar with the concept of basis of estimates because you will see it come up on the exam at least once. And then finally, develop schedule will give you your schedule baseline and the project schedule. Anytime you have, actually, let me back up. For planning, for the triple constraints are scope, schedule, cost. The last planning process and scope, schedule, and cost are going to give you your baselines. So the last planning process and scope is going to give you your scope baseline. The last planning process and schedule, as you can see here, is going to give you your schedule baseline. And the last planning process and cost is going to give you your cost baseline here. Okay, so that's just a sidebar tip for you for the exam. All right, so now we're in cost, not as many processes, but we still have some outputs to remember. Plan cost management, again, is going to give you our cost management plan. It's going to tell us how to manage costs on the project. It's not going to tell us what our estimates are or what our costs are. Estimate cost, again, is going to give you that basis of estimates and also your cost estimates. So basically, whatever you estimated for the cost of each activity and materials on your projects. Determine budget is the last planning process. That's going to give you your cost baseline and project funding requirements. Okay, so there's a set of outputs for each knowledge area on the grid. You have outputs for quality management. There's only 3 processes here, so it's not a huge list of outputs to memorize, but you'll want to know and get familiar with these outputs for each knowledge area. And the best way to do that is to create flashcards. Put a process on one side of the flashcard and put the major outputs on the back and just study those until the exam. That way, whenever you see something like resource breakdown structure, you'll know that you're in planning for resource management, right? Let me mute you, Jamila. Okay, sorry about that. If you mention that resource calendars have just been created, then you know that you've just finished acquiring resources and that you're in the planning part of resource management on the grid. And that will help you decipher what you should do next on the exam. Any questions so far? Let me check the chat to see if I have any questions. Okay, good to go. Okay, so for resource management, again, that's going to give us our resource management plan and our team charter. A team charter is very important, especially in the agile world. but this tells us kind of how we behave as teammates, how we make decisions together, what our ground rules are, how we should show up to meetings, how prepared we should be. Team charter just covers all of that stuff. It's almost like a project charter, but for the teammates, for collaboration purposes. For estimate activity resources, you're going to have two major outputs. You're going to have your resource breakdown structure, and again, your basis of estimates. Anytime you have an estimate planning process, you're going to have a basis of estimates as an output. Now for executing, acquire resources, you'll have a couple of major outputs, your actual resource assignments and the calendars. And develop team, you'll have some performance assessments, but you'll notice for managed team, there's nothing here. That means there's no major output that you'll need to know for managed team, and the same for control resources. So not every single process on the grid is going to have a major output, but the ones that do, you want to know. All right, a couple of more here. Communications management, just 3 processes here and not a whole lot of outputs to remember, but you definitely want to know your communications management plan comes from planned communications management. And your project communications, this is just the emails that you send, the information that you distribute, that's all project communications are. Those are an output of managed communications. So anytime you get a question about, actively sending and receiving information or distributing information on the project, you are in the process of managed communications. Okay, that's how you connect the dots on the process grid. We have risk management. Now, this is probably the most important set of outputs on the exam, just because PMI loves to reference the risk register and the risk report. So please know these outputs. But you'll notice that there's not a whole lot of outputs compared to the amount of processes in risk, and that's okay. All you need to know is plan risk management gives you your risk management plan, and identify risks gives you 2 major outputs, your risk register and your risk reports. And again, if you've been studying for the exam, you've probably come across the risk register at least 3 times in some form or fashion on practice questions. So get to know these outputs and know that anytime you're updating a risk register or anytime you're having to identify new risks, the output is going to have to be updated as well. Okay. The risk register is an uncontrolled document, meaning that it can be updated at any time as needed throughout the projects. Okay, it doesn't need to go through a formal change request process or anything like that. It can be updated by anyone on the team as soon as a new risk is identified. And then you'll notice that the perform qualitative risk analysis, perform quantitative risk analysis, plan risk responses, these don't have any outputs. Okay, there's only 3 that you need to know for risk. One note that I want to add here is I get a lot of PMP students that get confused by the different analyses processes in risk. Qualitative means that you're qualifying the risks, right? You're ranking the risks. So after you've identified all of the risks on the project, all of the potential mishaps that could happen, now you have this big long list of risks. Well, we need to know which ones are the most important and which ones are the most impactful. That's what perform qualitative risk analysis is going to help you get. It's going to help you rank your risks from highest probability to least probability, highest impact to least impact, and then perform quantitative risk analysis is going to take the top risks, right? The highest impact, the highest probability risks, and then start doing some calculations, right? Just how much impact will this have on the project? How much money will this cost us if this risk happened on the project, right? How likely is this actually supposed to happen, and how does our response look to this plan? That's why planned risk responses is a very last process in planning, because we need to qualify the most likely risks and then add a number to them and then plan around those only. So hopefully that helps you to decipher between these 2 processes. I had another client that used the phrase quality over quantity to memorize, which one comes first and which one comes second. That also works. But just know that, if you get a question about the team just finished ranking risks from highest to lowest probability, what should they do next? Well, they just finished qualifying all of the risks, and now they need to quantify them or go ahead and plan the risk response. Okay, any process that comes after qualitative risk analysis would be the correct answer if you're following the flow of processes. All right, we have two more, procurement management. Now, this one's a little tricky because most of your outputs are going to come from the only planning process in procurement management. So you have all of your, vendor documents, your bid documents, your statement of work, all the criteria that you're going to use to select your vendors. All of that comes out of planning for procurement. When you actually start to send out your RFPs and receive proposals back and review the proposals, now you're in conduct procurements. And the outputs of that is going to be the selected sellers, right? Some kind of list of vendors that you're going to use for this particular procurement or this particular project. And then the actual contract or the agreement between the buyer and the seller, you and the person that we're buying the work from. Control procurement is used to manage vendors, correct anything that's going off of track contract-wise, and it's also used to close out contracts. So close procurements, or control procurement rather, can be a little tricky. The output is closed procurements, but you also use this process to manage vendors and get them back on track if they're falling behind schedule or spending too much money. All right, I think I saw a question in the chat. Give me 1 second here. Is there a diagram tool for qualitating risk? Not necessarily. There's not many diagrams that are covered in the risk section. If you're familiar with just the risk register and knowing what's on there, which is, where you would rank those risks from highest probability to lowest probability, you're pretty much covered in that area. A good question. All right, and stakeholder engagement, again, just 4 processes here, but you definitely want to be familiar with identify stakeholders. Technically, that's the first process in stakeholder management. And the output is going to be your stakeholder register, which I'm going to assume everyone here has heard about. The stakeholder register is where, you identify all the stakeholders on your project, and then you classify them accordingly from high influence to low influence to, need to know information to resistance, et cetera, et cetera. And then your stakeholder engagement plan. Not much else comes out of stakeholder engagement, so don't overwhelm yourself in this area. And again, the key to memorizing these outputs is to create flashcards. It's the easiest way to connect the dots. All right, so let's go back to our practice questions. During planning, a PM receives approval to baseline the schedule. Which artifact will likely be produced next? Now, if you guessed A for cost management plan, you are correct. Let's talk about why. So I'm going to go back to our schedule and cost outputs. So we just received approval to baseline the schedule. That means that we just finished developing the schedule, right? Because our output is schedule baseline. And so if we're thinking about what we should do next, we're going to follow the flow of the process grid. Well, after scheduling comes cost, right? And any one of these answers would be correct because it comes after developed schedule on the process grid. So if we go back to our answer choices here, cost management plan we know comes next, which is the right answer. Basis of estimates sounds like it might be right, but this is more of a justification of how you get your estimates, right? It's not going to be produced next because that is what you're going to use to kind of get your estimate your costs, right? You're going to itemize all of your costs. That comes after your cost management plan. So it's skipping a step if you pick this choice, right? You got to follow the flow of the process grid. Plan cost management comes before estimate costs. That's why cost management plan is the more correct choice in this list of options. Units of measure is not really something that's produced on its own. It's actually a part of your schedule management plan or a part of your cost management plan. So you could say that these answers kind of contradict each other, but if you're using PMI logic, you're always going to go with the higher level option. So even though units of measure might be included in a cost management plan, the cost management plan is the more umbrella artifact. So that is going to be the correct answer. And then resource breakdown structure, this question is not addressing resources. So this one wouldn't be relevant. You can kind of scratch this one off as a distractor altogether. So that's how you come up with your answer, a cost management plan. Yeah, I just think I saw a question in the chat. But the question says approval to go ahead and baseline the schedule. Yes. So if the PM received approval to baseline the schedule, that means that they're in developed schedule, the process that actually gets you your baseline schedule. So they're going to move on to the next logical process on the process grid, which is going to be some of your cost processes, either plan cost management, cost estimates, or determine budget. Those are the only 3 planning cost processes. Okay, so if we look at the process grid, let me just pull it back up here so we can kind of get an overview. Now here, it said that we just received approval to schedule our, to baseline our schedule, and that comes out of develop schedule. So the next step in the process will be any of these that fall after develop schedule. And in our list of choices, cost management plan came first. So that's the one that we're going to use because that's an output of the very next process on the process grid. That's how that logic works. Does that answer your question, John, or does that kind of help you decipher?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
I didn't know my mic was on. Yeah, well, it's kind of confusing because I thought they were saying to gather the tools needed to develop the actual baseline schedule once you've been approved to do so. So to do that, you would need WBS, you need all that stuff to develop it, right? The actual baseline schedule. But I guess they're actually saying, yeah, go ahead.
It's okay. And that's a fair thought process. But if you read the question and you really want to pay attention to what PMI is asking you, right? It says during planning, a project manager receives approval to baseline the schedule. So if he's already or she has already received approval to baseline the schedule, that means that they have already completed all these processes above it, according to PMI logic. That means they already sequenced the activities, they've already gathered and defined their activities, and they've already done all the scope work. They've created their WBS, they've created their scope baseline. So the next logical process is to follow the process grid from top to bottom. Does that make sense?
So the schedule's already created is what it is, and then the actual approval, the baseline, it is, okay, since it's already created, your baseline is now approved, move on.
Correct.
Gotcha.
Exactly.
Okay. Interpretation on some of these questions, though, is, man.
It's half the battle, right? Just figuring out what it's asking you. Yeah, exactly. And for some reason, for process, it really gets confusing because you don't really know what it's asking you. You don't know which process is being referred to. So hopefully this is helping you guys kind of connect the dots there. All right, last one. If you guessed verified deliverables on this question, great job. The reason is the PM has begun testing a deliverable to ensure it meets the technical quality metrics defined in the plan. So this is telling us that the deliverable has been created. Now they're in control quality where they're doing the testing and making sure that these deliverables actually meet the quality standards on our project. Well, if we look at our outputs guide for quality, we know that control quality has an output of verified deliverables. So at the end of the process that they're doing in control quality, they're going to end up with verified deliverables as an output, meaning these deliverables have passed the quality process and the quality tests. They are verified and good to go for the projects. Okay, so going back to our list of options here, we have accepted deliverables. Well, we know that accepted deliverables are an output of validate scope. So wrong process and wrong part of the process grid, right? We're not talking about scope here, we're talking about quality. So we're going to scratch that one off our list altogether. Verified deliverables we know is the correct answer. What about validated scope? The question asks which output is produced at the end of the review, right? Which outputs? In this case, we want to make sure that we're referring to outputs only. Validate scope is a process. Okay, that's not an output. So we're going to eliminate that altogether. Which output is produced at the end of the review? Is it final release? Maybe, but final release means that we're done with the project. So if we're already on the final release, we've skipped a few steps in between. So that's also not going to be our answer. Okay, so associating outputs with the process on the grid is going to help you figure out the puzzle kind of mystery behind the process domain. All right, and then last question here. This one talked about decomposing deliverables into work packages. What's the most logical next step for the PM? The correct answer is going to be develop the schedule. And I see a few questions coming in, so let me pause and answer those before I go over this last one. Let's see. So Chris says one thing that helps is using AI to help me see the keywords in the question. Yeah, that's a great way to practice. Using ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini, put the question in and help it to or ask it to help you identify the key words, the operative words in each question, and figure out what it's really asking you, because that will guide you as you're deciphering through the options. Nice. Thank you for that tip, Carice. And then, okay, Precious is kind of applying to that. All right, so question number 3. The answer here is develop the schedule. So let's break down the question. This one says the project team has just finished decomposing deliverables into manageable work packages. Where do work packages come from? They come from our WBS, right? Create WBS, our work breakdown structure. So we know automatically that we're in scope planning, okay? We're in scope planning. The scope statements and the dictionary, oops, where'd my pen go? Scope statement and the scope dictionary are finalized. So we have a scope statement, which is an output of defined scope, and we have a dictionary. The dictionary is the WBS dictionary. So we know we have the WBS created and the dictionary in our scope statement. If you've been studying, you know that the 3 of those make up your scope baseline. Your scope statement, your WBS, and your WBS dictionary. Those 3 together make up your scope baseline. So this question is telling you that you just created your scope baseline, but you won't know that until you study the outputs on the process grid. Let's go back to the process grid so that you can kind of tie these things together. So here it says we just finished creating a scope statement. We just finished creating our WBS and our dictionary. The output of that is our scope baseline. So we know that we just finished completing our scope baseline. That means the next logical step is probably going to be schedule or cost or something that comes after scope. So going back to our question here, I know I'm hopping around a lot, but bear with me. What's the most logical next step for the PM? Well, let's start breaking this down. If we just created our scope baseline, are we ready to execute just yet? Probably not, right? We still have schedule and cost and quality and risk and all these other knowledge areas to plan for. This is probably not going to be our answer for the exam. Control scope changes. Well, after we baseline our scope, do we automatically go and control it? Probably not until we've actually started to do some work on the project, right? There's nothing to control just yet. Our scope baseline was just created. So it's probably not going to be that one either. Obtain formal acceptance from the customer. Well, we know that is accepted deliverables. Accepted deliverables are an output of validate scope, right? So again, it's trying to take us from planning straight over into validate scope, which is not logical in PMI's mind. So we're also going to eliminate that answer, which leaves us with develop the schedule. Because again, it's the next logical process after scope planning. Okay. So in conclusion, study your ITTOs, create flashcards, especially for the tools and techniques, but also create flashcards for the major outputs that are connected to each process on the grid. Learn the flow of each bucket of planning processes. Learn the flow of how scope goes from collect requirements to the WBS. Learn the flow of risks, how it goes from identify risks to plan risk responses, and all the different processes in between. And then know your outputs. Start to associate what comes out of each process with the process itself. That way you won't get tripped up on the exam if it only references the output, because you'll know which process it's connected to. And if you know the process, you know exactly where you are on the grid and you'll know what to do next. I really, really hope this hour has helped you guys. If you have any questions, please let me know. In the meantime, I do have exam coaching services, plenty of study guides on my website for pretty nominal fees. They're $2.99, $4.99, pretty cheap stuff. But I do encourage you all to take a look, study your outputs, connect the dots, and please, if you have a chance, leave a review on Google for my websites. I'll put that in the chat. Thank you so much. And leave a Google review just if this has been helpful or if you find these things valuable to your PMP study. Otherwise, and I'm putting all of these links in the chat as well so that you guys can just easily click on them. I'll leave this up for a second. Thank you so much for joining PMP Refresh Hour this month. It was a blast having you guys. And tell a friend, tell a study group, share the love. Bye, you guys. I'll stay around if you have any questions, but otherwise, you're free to hop off. Thank you again for joining. Have a lovely Wednesday.
Hi, Johnny.
Hi, Sharek.